Divinity or humanity? How do you live today? I can tell you years ago, I had no idea what either one of those terms really meant. When I first started this process of enlightenment, basically what happened for me was after 54 days of not drinking and drugging, and I had some awakenings, I had some awarenesses, and then one day I had just a very large buried awareness of being severely abused as a little boy. It was one of those moments in time where I just knew nothing was going to be the same. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I didn't know how I was supposed to do it. I didn't know where I was going to go, what I was going to do. I just knew that everything had to be different. So I changed everything. I broke up with the girlfriend I was with. I moved out of the city. I closed down my business. I actually moved into a warehouse district so I could just be alone and away and safe, or at least I thought. At nighttime, I would walk outside and literally there wouldn't be another living human within 20 miles of where I was because that district was closed down. I was literally alone. In the beginning, it was great. Eventually, emotions started coming up. Eventually, rage started coming out. Grief started to happen. And I kind of got back in balance of life a little bit. First 3 years of that 7-year process, I lived on less than $3,000 a year. That was $300 a month. Do the math. I didn't live on very much. I didn't need to. All I needed was a place to stay dry and a little bit of food, and I was fine. Well, eventually I moved into a separate room with a support person that I had where I paid $200 a month, and I basically was able to live there. I had a bathroom, and that's all I needed. So as the process went on, I spent a lot of time alone. I learned the concept of the inner child, which basically gave me the opportunity to bring a voice to my deepest and darkest parts, bring a voice to those parts of myself that were buried because of abandonment, because of neglect, because of basically an inability for my environment when I was a kid to embrace and to nurture the emotional side of myself. And before I go any further, I want everybody to understand that when we're on a spiritual journey and we're healing things that kind of affected us in the past, this is not about blaming anybody else. My parents did absolutely the best they could. But the consciousness of the time, they didn't have an awareness of how important it is to embrace the emotional side of self. They just didn't know. So just because they were unconscious doesn't mean that it wasn't effective to me, because it was. And as I healed and I brought a voice to those deeper parts, I realized over time my parents did the best they could, and it was up to me now to truly heal the depths of my pain. And that's what I did. Well, it's kind of funny, this humanity versus divinity concept. I didn't really at the time know anything about a higher power. I'm here to tell you, if you've never heard the concept of a higher power, each of us, all of us, anybody on the planet, we all have a higher power, all of us. I don't really care if you believe it or you don't believe it. I don't care if you've got a great relationship or you have no relationship. It really doesn't matter. The truth is, we all have a higher power. And you can connect to that part, or you can stay disconnected to the part. Probably if you're listening and you're part of my channel here, you've got a sense that there's a higher power, and that higher power is going to help you in your life. Well, years ago, I mean, we're talking 25, 30 years ago, I knew nothing about that whole concept. Zero. Well, one day I was in my room, and back then, computers really weren't a thing very much. I had a phone, I think. Texting wasn't a thing. I know I didn't have an email address. I had no TV. I would sit there all day long. And basically one day I'm sitting there and I hear a voice. And this voice says, "You're gonna write." I said, "I'm not writing." The voice kept saying, "Joe, you're gonna write." I said, "Listen to me clearly. I'm not writing." The voice says, "You're writing or you're not sleeping." Now I have to put this all in context. I'm in a room with just myself. I would go 4 or 5 days and not speak to anybody. This is a voice in my head that later I realized, later I became aware of, it was my higher power talking to me. So I'm in a battle. I'm literally battling with me. about the whole concept of writing or not writing. And eventually I said, okay, with a bunch of cuss words in there, I'll write. I got a piece of paper, I got a pen. The poem Soulmates came through me. If you buy my book here, Healing Addiction, Soulmates is one of the poems in there. Well, didn't think anything of it. The next day, another poem came through me. The next day, another poem came through me. Similar to the energy rush that struck me sober a couple years before. When I say came through me, I mean all I was doing was listening. It wasn't an original thought. It weren't my thoughts, these poems. Probably a month into this whole process, the same power says to me, it's time to start writing. And I, at this point, got pretty familiar with it. I knew there was nothing I could do. I wanted to sleep, of course. So I would start to write. Over a 22-month period of time, 275 pages of legal paper, because I wrote on legal paper, 105,000 words came through me, literally. It's the book right here. My book used to be called Your Inner Child Has Rights Too, because I was so connected to myself and the inner child that it was just such a passion for me. It still is a passion for me. We changed the title to Healing Addiction, and basically the way you heal addiction is you connect to the wounds of your inner child. All addiction can be healed. All addiction can be healed. I am a living representation of that. How? Well, you have to embrace the reason that you're addicted in the first place. Your addiction isn't the issue. Your addiction is the symptom to the issue. And the issue is hurt, pain, suppressed emotion that's inside you. Well, back to this whole concept of divinity versus humanity, right? This voice just came through me. And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and then I eventually finished, and I read it to a couple people, one person in particular. And you know, I would read it and I was like, wow, that's pretty good. Wow, that makes a lot of sense. Wow, the end of that book is quite amazing. Now, literally 25 years ago, I lived in a room spending $200 a month. I had nothing. But if you read the end of my book, it sounds as though, because the book is my story, this original book is my story, it sounds like I've got this great life. Well, interestingly enough, 25 years ago, the voice coming through me was describing my life of today, 25 years later. At the time, of course, I didn't know that. And at the time, I wouldn't have called it a higher power. A couple of years later, another book started coming through me. And literally that second book that I called back then 21st Century Sales from the Soul, eventually then it became a book called Enlightened Leadership. That book came through me in the exact same way. It was one of those things to where I can't really take credit for it, except for the concept of God can only do for me what God can do through me. And that's exactly what happened with these books. Well, long story short, I kind of walked out of that process. I got back into life. I'm in my late 30s now. I'm at church. I look across the aisle there. I see a woman and I say, I'm going to marry her. Lo and behold, I did. 2.5 years later, I married the preacher's daughter. Back then, I really thought that it was going to be time for me to put my message out into the world, do seminars, do inner child work, and help people. Well, God had a different plan. 20 years later, literally 23 years later, my wife and I got married. We had a great life. We had 2 children. Our paths separated because basically we kind of just did things differently. My path led me one way. Her path led another way, so our worlds went in separate directions. Okay, that's about 9 years ago now. Well, what happened was, over time, I got very connected with my kids. I became a single dad. And in that whole world, this whole idea of books and seminars and putting it out there in the world, it just kind of went away. It just was closed down. September 22nd, 2022, I'm listening to a podcast of a woman, a very beautiful woman, hugely successful, just sold her business for multiples of millions of dollars. She just launched 2 beautiful girls into college. She just sold the house that they lived in forever. And in the interview, The interviewer said to her, and she's talking, she says, "My only failure in life was my marriage." The same voice that wrote 2 books through me came up and said, you didn't fail at your marriage. You chose to live your divinity over your humanity. Your divinity over your humanity. Now, to this day, I've never met this woman. I've seen her in a couple other podcasts, but I've never met this woman as I'm making this video. I'm literally screaming at the screen, divinity, divinity. You're living your spiritual divinity. You outgrew your husband is what happens. It didn't mean he was right and you were wrong, or you're right and he's wrong. There's no right or wrong. We're all on spiritual paths. And when our paths move in a divinity way from a place of divinity, that's God's path. Right after that happened, the voice is back. I've written a book called Unequally Yoked. I'm about 40, 50, 60% done. The same voice, my same divinity voice is coming through me again. I go and I look for those old books. They've been stored for 20 years. I find them in a box. They were stored on 100 meg discs. Now, for any of you younger viewers here, you probably don't even know what a floppy disk is. Well, it was the technology of the day, 100 meg disk. I found it. It took me 4 months to find somebody that had the technology to get that information off that old disk onto new technology so we could produce the book. And this is the book right here. I share all that story because all of us have a higher power. All of us can live divinity. If you're watching me, if you follow what I talk about, if you're in this genre of spiritual growth, you're being guided by your divinity. Now, how do we know the difference? Your divinity voice is going to be the voice of all inclusion versus your ego voice, which is going to be an all or nothing voice. In future videos, I'll talk about those 2 concepts very specifically, but I ask you the question, humanity or divinity? Which are you choosing to live today?